which is a gathering meeting place from ancient Greece. But it's an open forum session to have a chat about concussion in sport as a contemporary issue. The two questions that we pose are these. Who is responsible for the design and development of sports concussion policies? Now, that might seem like an obvious answer, but we'd be very happy to open that discussion. Who should carry ultimate responsibility at sports events? So I thought I would start by introducing our panellists, and again, it's an open forum, so we're happy to engage in some discussion about this topic. And I'll start with Keith Benny here on my left, and ask Keith to introduce himself and a little bit of background as to how his involvement in sports-related concussion.
Thanks, Annette. So I'm the General Counsel for the NZRU, as you will have read. And my involvement in concussion really is at a range of levels. At one level, it's liaising with the international body, which is now called World Rugby, around the setting of the laws of the game and the setting of concussion policy that applies across the world. And I can talk a little bit more about the detail of where that sits at the moment, but generally it's I think most people would say it's in a not too bad space now. The incidents like the George Smith incident in relation to the Lions a few years ago sort of jolted the IRB, or as it then was, the World Rugby, into action now. Then the next level is at NZRU level, so we develop our own basically set of domestic safety law variations, which is how we deem it appropriate to apply the laws of the game to various age groups and competitions within our particular jurisdiction. And again, that has some specific rules around concussion. Then we also have a role as setting policy for concussion management within each of the provincial associations. So there's a program called the Blue Card, and that's operating around New Zealand in various provinces at the moment, which is basically it's the same as a red card. If a referee sees that somebody's got signs, that any suspected signs of concussion, they get a blue card, which basically means they're off for the rest of the game, can't come back on, and in fact they can't play again until they've been cleared of being asymptomatic by a medical practitioner. So we also administer that part of the environment, and then we have a role, because all of the professional players are in New Zealand anyway are our employees, so we have a role as their employer to make sure they operate in a safe and healthy workplace and that they're not exposed to unnecessary risks. We also have a whole bunch of legal duties under the Health and Safety and Employment Act, as it then was, but it's now, as you heard, it's going to be essentially the same as your WorkSafe Act. And so we have a bunch of responsibilities there because we are the match, we're the event organiser, and we control places of work, and so we have a whole bunch of health and safety obligations that arise out of that. And then we also develop a whole lot of educational resources. So there's basically in New Zealand you cannot coach rugby at any level for any team, no matter what age group, without having gone through a Rugby Smart course, which will teach you about concussion and concussion management. Will teach you about tackling techniques and how to do that safely and avoid concussion and how to recognise it. So that's 10,000 coaches that get put through that every year. And then the last thing that I get involved with in sort of the negative end of the scene is we currently have a couple of coroner's inquests going into 2 deaths from, jury's out about whether it's concussion, but anyway, there were players who had multiple head knocks during games and it ended up dying. So there's a coronial inquest into those 2. So those are at a practical level. That's our interface with concussion, working for the NSO.
Terrific. Okay, thank you, Keith. So Lisa.
I guess my interest in concussion has stemmed from my partnership with Annette. So the last couple of years, we have our little colloquium, and then we've had a lot of brainstorming around this area. So in sport management, predominantly our role, we talk about governance, we talk about strategy and policy, and in the law space, they're about regulation. And however, these words are very similar, but our aim is, well, who's actually enforcing this governance and this regulation? How is it managed? Who's recording the data? Who's ultimately responsible for concussion management? And most national sporting organisations or even sport clubs will have a lovely concussion policy. Step 1, this is what you do. Step 2, and it looks great, it ticks a box, but on game day, who is actually managing that and making sure that they're sticking to that? And that's a concern that I'm looking at from a governance perspective and regulation from a net. Secondly, an area is obviously culture in sport, and I think in Australia, historically, we have, a bit of a manly culture where, if you did get concussed, and it was only a few years ago, the guys, you'd see them knocked out, they'd get back up and get cheered on to keep playing. It was a sign of great strength and Australianness, I should call it. But so how do we as sport administrators change the culture of sport where it's seen okay to go off the field if you've had a concussion or you have an injury? And that's, I think, culture we're still dealing with. Extremities, I guess, of this situation, which we don't want. In a recent letter by the Australian Medical Association to the Australian Olympic Committee, basically advised that they want to ban all combat sports for all children under the age of 18. So we have our two extremes here. So how do we find a middle ground? And from a sport administrator policy, that is my interest.
Right, thank you. And we have Dr. Ryan Kohler here. Just a 5-minute overview of your interest in concussion, the work that you've done, and then we'll look at these questions in this open forum. So Ryan, welcome.
Thanks, Annette. My background is very much as a specialist sports physician and clinician, so I've had an interest in research, but for 15 years I've really dealt with concussion on field, both at elite level and at community level. My interest started back in 2001, where I was involved in setting up the first concussion program for Springbok Rugby, and from there realised that the brains of those players were more important than the ones that were playing community sport every weekend. So in 2003, went on a campaign of setting up a national sports concussion program called Sports Concussion South Africa, which still exists and flourishes today. When leaving South Africa in 2010, my vision was to do the same here, and founded HeadSmart in 2012. And so the focus is based on, I guess, a more mobile model, but one of accessing or engaging with schools and clubs and giving them what Australian elite sports would get. I see it as having two arms, very much the policy side, which is under discussion today, but also you have to have practical means and tools to manage or prepare the athlete for head injury, but also guide them as to recognition and access to medical facilities in order to reduce complications. So with that background, I guess it's been a 15-year crusade, and certainly seen a lot of changes in that time.
That's wonderful. So again, just in keeping with the theme of this colloquium of the interdisciplinarity of concussion, it actually came from Alison Doherty's work back in 2012 when she was talking about it takes a village to look at a problem, and she used concussion as an example, and really that started the interest of looking at this, saying that it is very difficult to approach this problem through a single disciplinary lens. It's important to put it in the soup mix, if you like. So we're putting all of these ideas into the melting pot, and we're not holding on to our unique disciplinary perspectives. We need to make sure that we're conscious of the practical, the policy, the application, the regulatory environment. So my background in this is, it's just been something I've been looking at since 2011, and I've started, I'm in my final stages of PhD research into it. But I was intrigued to find that this is not a new issue. This is not something that's just come from the NFL litigation in the US. I mean, that certainly had an impact in terms of the responses of the regulators, and for those who adopt a regulatory approach. When I talk about regulation, I'm talking about it in the sense of the work from Julia Black, which is any deliberate act that's designed to alter or influence the behaviour of others. So not just the legal regulation, looking at a whole range of regulatory forms. So with that in mind, as I said, this is not a new issue that's arisen and just following the NFL. I found a report from 22 years ago written by the Football Head and Neck Injury Committee of the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia, suggesting that there were things that needed to be done in this space. And so 22 years later, there are some things being done in the space. But again, it's something that I thought we could use as this forum as a way of saying, well, who are the actors in the regulatory space, or who are the actors out there that have the capacity to alter and influence the behaviour of others? Who is it that we're trying to educate? Should we be investing in research? And who should be investing in research? Obviously, concussion management and concussion prevention are obviously things that are unique to this particular sports as well, but nonetheless fall into that sort of discussion space. So with that in mind, perhaps we could open the floor to anyone who's got some ideas and suggestions about who we think are the actors that we see involved and who should be involved in this space. How about the sports governing body as a starting point? The International Federation, the IOC. What about non-Olympic sports though? So again, there are a number of actors that occupy positions in the space. The players, the participants themselves. And let's pick up from the theme that Kyle referred to earlier in our afternoon session, which is about the risks. I mean, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the risk of injury that comes as a result of participating in collision and contact sports? Or are we talking about the latent risks that we don't necessarily know for sure what they are yet because the science is still evolving? So are we talking about the risks of potential exposure to issues that we may not yet fully understand? Because it does seem to be, and perhaps Ryan, you can pick the science up, and this is the medical scientific perspective, that there may still be two sort of polar views in terms of whether or not there is definitive evidence yet about the long-term risks and what they are.
A good point. I was asked on an interview yesterday if 1 to 2 concussions cause long-term effects, and had I seen any patients to demonstrate that, and my answer was quite clearly no. What must you do when players had 5 or more concussions? Does that cause long-term problems? We don't know, but you would certainly want to manage that player differently it's a unique group of players and a minority that really needs case-by-case management, a multidisciplinary team decision which involves, does this person continue with that particular sport or not? And the testing that goes into those decisions, you would do that on the basis that if it turned out that there were long-term effects, then you had implemented best practice at the time. My view is, we can't change what happened in 1980, 90, whatever. Let's do what we can today correctly. Then, at some stage, there shouldn't be these questions being asked if we manage it in the present well.
That's right. Lisa? Following on from that, the implementation side of it.
And definitely, and I think we've got issues now stemming from a sport administrator point of view of parents not allowing their children into these sports. So if we start seeing a decline of children participating in sports, and that's obviously going to affect down the track this high performance. So the implementation at the top end needs to be, I guess, clear and reassuring to the next generations who want to play these combat and contact sports. And there's quite a bit of work. I think there are a lot of scared parents, and obviously the movie Concussion that's just come out probably isn't helping many parents put their kids into these sports. But I think if it does come to Australia and hit rugby and AFL and rugby league, I think we're in for some big issues.
I suppose one of the actors that we didn't mention originally was the government. I mean, is there a role that the state plays in terms of concussion regulation? Yeah.
I often worry about the state as an actor in concussion management because they act for reasons that often don't take account of player safety or participant safety, and in some cases mixed martial arts. Some jurisdictions, Victoria until recently in Western Australia, banned the cage because it seemed to be, obscene and objectionable on moral grounds. But you are much more likely to get a concussion falling out of the ring because there isn't a cage to keep you in than if you are in the ring. And similarly, the idea that there are some socially acceptable combat sports, and I'm lucky enough that wrestling is one of the sort of Olympic socially acceptable ones. Karate seems to be sort of with its association with children another. There are more socially acceptable sports like boxing that probably need much more regulation than very socially unacceptable sports, kickboxing, MMA, so on and so forth, in which the intrinsic risk of concussion is actually probably a lot less than in boxing, where they stand people up to keep getting punched in the head after they've fallen down once. So, I mean, when we talk about the state as an actor, you've got a difficulty insofar as their motivations often aren't pure in the sense of concussion management.
Well, we can look around internationally and see what's happened. In the United States, all of the 50 states plus the District of Columbia have implemented youth concussion laws that over a period of time have been perhaps criticised for perhaps being a blunt instrument, not necessarily achieving a great deal. However, there has certainly been an increase of awareness. So there are now more concussions that are being reported and diagnosed as a result of the increase in the awareness side of it. But also recently, which I think is probably a good case study for those that are interested in this space, is Canada. With the recent passage of what's now called Rowan's Law, a young 17-year-old rugby union player who continued to play through multiple concussions over a period of a relatively short space, and who tragically died. Her parents were heavily involved in lobbying government, so there has been now legislation passed in Canada, in Ontario, in regard to youth concussion laws. So it'll be interesting to see if that sort of motivation triggers a response from the state as an actor in that space. But legislation is just one regulatory tool, isn't it, in the toolkit. Perhaps there are other forms of regulation that we can think about here. Removing changing the cultural aspect of concussion, and perhaps players being willing to put their hand up. We mentioned that, you mentioned the George Smith incident from a number of years ago, but just a few weeks ago, an AFL player, Ty Vickery, for those from Victoria might know him, I think he's a Richmond player, was in one of the, one of the pre-season games, and was actually captured on film, on the recording, continuing to play in a very disoriented state. He'd been concussed, but continued to play nonetheless. So again, compliance is a really interesting question of itself. You can have the rules and the policies, guidelines, regulations, whatever we call them, but compliance is obviously a very important aspect as well. Yes?
Have the insurers taken any interest or position in this? Because clearly they're the ones who are going to be paying at the end of the day if it continues to go wrong.
Well, that's an interesting question. I might ask Keith to just answer that from the New Zealand perspective, which obviously has a different compensation regime, but is there an insurance, any component that's come out of New Zealand?
So in New Zealand, all personal injury is covered by, or compensation for personal injury is covered by the accident compensation regime. So effectively the state is the only insurer for personal injury by accident. So we have the ACC, and that's been the case for 40 years in New Zealand. And so that in that particular case, they have a very direct interest in funding research into concussion, into developing educational tools and the effective management of concussion. They pay us hundreds of thousands of dollars to manage concussion responsibly, and they've recently published an article where they've analysed sort of 10 years of data, and they've got a whole lot of really interesting information around incidents of concussion in men and women, different ethnic groups, different sports, but I think the next stage for them is funding research into the long-term effects of concussion. They're very good at, they can tell you the average cost of a concussion in the community game, it's basically at any level, but it's the issue about the so what down the track where, and they'll be picking, they in New Zealand they will pick up the tab for that, the cost. So yeah, they have a direct interest in.
And in other jurisdictions, I know in the United States, after the NFL litigation was started, there was something like 32 different insurers across the relevant period of time that the players were complaining about. So, from the 60s to 2000s. And each of those insurers were then in litigation with the NFL about their obligations because they were refusing to say it was on their under their control. So, but here I believe the situation is that the risk managers within the national sporting organisations have the issue elevated on their risk agenda, but if they haven't got it on the risk agenda now, they certainly should, because the question from a legal vulnerability point of view is what did they know and at what point in time did they know it? And so I suppose it raises those interesting questions. Jack Anderson, who's a sports law scholar from Belfast, wrote a really interesting paper about the legal vulnerabilities associated with concussion and what the sports governing body should have known and ought to have known at the relevant time. Now, with the NFL litigation, obviously, because they settled that, we didn't get the opportunity to pore over, the disclosed documents and to see what it was that perhaps they did know. But our global sports law and governance students have seen the movie Concussion, so we've got that as a bit of an assignment to review. But I've got to say, it was probably pretty close to the truth, apart from some of the Hollywood embellishment. Yeah, Craig.
It's in that space as well that you'd be aware of the Michael Watson case of the responsible
Yes.
trial, where he sued them for liability on the basis of his injury, and their defence was, but we're doing as much as anybody else is doing in boxing rings all around the world. Because the court said also, well, that's not enough. So the courts obviously have involved in terms of determining what the level of ESO's liability might be within boxing information in New Zealand. But
So maybe a question then is litigation of itself a regulatory tool? Like the fact that a small group of, relatively, it's not going to compensate the group, but the group that takes the litigation is, potentially going to be seeing compensation if they get through the hurdles. But of course the hurdles that we heard about today include the civil liability legislation across our jurisdiction here.
the whole regime of ringside requirements.
Yeah,
is
change.
completely changed.
Absolutely. So it's the catalyst for change that follows that, just like there were changes, I think, in rugby union as well with the type of scrums as a result of Agar and Hyde and other matters that had come to light. So any other points what about just following on from your point, Tom, about the state getting involved and the question about whether the state should be an actor or whether, what its motivations are. In the United States, and I know I'm drawing from that jurisdiction, but I suppose there is sort of a information to look at and then critique. The question is whether this is a public health issue. Should this be framed in a way that is one that is there's a social cost, there's a public health cost to the potential support that's needed down the track? There are both direct and indirect social costs associated with concussion. Is that something that maybe might motivate or may be relevant for consideration?
I guess where I become concerned about talking about social costs of concussions is that it's something that we're willing to put dollar amounts on fairly easily, but it's much harder to put dollar amounts on the value of sports diplomacy, the value of the sporting community, the value of sport to reach across ethnic and race lines, and I think combat sports in particular have done that quite well in ways that a lot of the other mainstream sports are still struggling with. So I don't want to be saying, we shouldn't do concussion management because there are all these other virtues to sport. Of course we need to do concussion management, we need to do it very well. But again, as soon as the state comes into play, their motivations, particularly when there's a dollar sign attached to it, start to look very different from what a community might think is the relevant factors.
Yeah, Bob, and then to Laura.
I'm not the one to dispute what Tom says, but I think an even worse situation, you could have a self-regulation. I would not trust the organising competition commissions or bodies to be any less concerned than the state. So if you've got this tension between whether it's the state going to legislate or the governing governing body going to self-regulate, then I have a feeling the state may be more appropriate than the national governing body.
Well, we currently do have self-regulating associations, the governing bodies self-regulating, aren't they, in the space? Well, yeah, I suppose, but certainly in, if you look back over the period of time, there's certainly been a significant increase of awareness along the lines of concussion management, concussion prevention, concussion research and concussion education. So across those sort of 4 areas. And you could probably trace it from, they vary across the sports, and I'm not saying this is in any definitive way, but the research I've undertaken, I've seen certainly a spike from around about 2012, and there has been a variety of approaches prior to that date. So again, it'll come down to what was the expectation? To my knowledge, there has been no litigation that's specifically been filed as yet in relation to specific cases against the sports governing body relating to concussion. There's been murmurs in the press about potential actions, but nothing that I've yet seen, unless someone else has got access to that.
Just one example on that. I'm actually on the board of the Australian Bobsleigh and Skeleton Association, and their international governing body, International Bobsleigh and Skeleton, this season or towards the end of last year have implemented, I guess, a top-down approach to managing athlete concussion, which does happen quite frequently in those events. So it is self-managed by the athlete. So if there is a crash, the race technician at the race will make note of that. That athlete then needs to get doctor's clearance, and then they have to go online and do an online concussion test that proves that they've got things. And again, it's a step-by-step process, and they can't register to race again until all those things are cleared up. So from an international federation, I think they're doing a pretty good job, and that's fairly new, and they're taking that responsibility from an international level, which I think is quite good.
Laura, you had a point to raise
Well, I
before.
was actually going to say a similar thing in terms of the regulation perspective, but the other thing is I feel like we're talking a little bit about regulation concussions with a broad brush at all levels when there are very different governance processes depending on the level of sport we're talking about. In the Ontario case that you brought up is an interesting one because that's the first time in Ontario that there's discussions at the youth sport level. So that's really about that child protection piece. And particularly in sports and in Canada, it's about hockey. You have hockey parents who don't want to suggest that their child is injured because then they can't play. And so in those cases, I'm not sure that the governing bodies are doing a good enough job at this point. There isn't the governance mechanisms, and maybe there needs to be some other mechanism in place to help support that. And then perhaps at the high performance level, when you're talking about that, then yes, for the international organizations, they're the ones, as the example that Lisa just gave, that is a good place to be regulating that quite clearly. And that's a great example of where they are doing some of that regulation.
Yeah, that's right. So it certainly raises that sort of the duality of interest, perhaps the sports governing body as the custodian of the sport, for past, present and future generations. But in addition to that, the sports governing body is the organiser of the competition, of which has a number of levels as well, and interests and commercial interests as well.
I think getting back to some issues, basic issues of duty of care, where that might lie based on the level of sport and what the responsibilities are associated with that. Certainly the commercial interest of those national organisations is going to come into play in that. And we've seen that a lot in Canada, them not wanting to implement concussion policies because they're quite concerned that that's going to then impede their commercial interests, that their players aren't going to be able to be, or they're going to have their logo and then they're going to get a concussion, that's going to look back at their company. So there's some very serious issues associated with some of those ideologies as well.
Yeah, that's right. Eric, did you?
Look, I just had a couple of observations. Hopefully knit some of these things together. First of all, once things have been decided in the courts, it's too late. The horse has bolted. You're putting it in the hands of lawyers. They're the worst group of people to resolve this. And I'm a lawyer, so it's okay. The one thing for sure, every actor in this has their own self-interest. And if you leave it to one actor on their own, then that actor's self-interest is going to dominate. That's human nature. So therefore, we need to have a forum which brings different interests together, where they can be balanced, they can be weighed, and trade-offs are going to have to be made. There's not going to be an answer that everyone's going to have all their interests met. There's going to be trade-offs. In our society, that's government. government is the forum through which we make those trade-offs and we strike those balances. It's not perfect, and from that though, there's one set of interests that I don't see being represented, at least at the professional level, adequately, and that's the players. If this was in any other industrial setting, you would have organised labour representing the interests of the workers against the interests of organised capital management. And what I see in most of the professional sports, and I don't know rugby union, so Keith, I'd be interested in your perspective, is I see, at least in the code that I'm closest to, I believe that the Players' Union, and this is Australian Rules Football Players Association, is a captive of the AFL. And they don't independently represent the interests of the players. And so I was wondering whether or not there is, at least at the professional level, true forceful representation of the players' interests in this debate, independent of the governing body.
Well, it's a very good observation. In rugby, so we've had a players' association since 2000. And there's been an international players' association probably since 2005. They've really struggled to engage with the with World Rugby, the international federation, partly because the national associations haven't wanted the players' association to deal with the IRB, because the IRB doesn't employ any players, and so the World Rugby's had real difficulties engaging with the players, but they're absolutely independent of. So in our case, in New Zealand's case, they're absolutely independent of rugby. They engage on all issues of player welfare. So and in the last 3 years anyway, and you've probably seen them. Are you on the World Rugby? Those World Rugby medical? Do you sit on those at all, or have you involved in World?
Australian Rugby Union.
Yeah. So now the Players Association goes to all the medical conferences and are involved in all of the player welfare initiatives that the IRB do. I wouldn't say that they, collectively negotiate them, and there's sort of not currently, but that's what they're aiming for. That's what they want to. That's where they want to get to. So that it's just the IRB can't simply impose a concussion policy on players and say, well, that's the end of the story, and it'll come. There's a huge global movement of the players' associations, led by Aussie Brendan
Schwab.
Schwabby.
The uni players group.
Yeah. So it'll come, but you're right. At the moment, it's not the check and balance on the system that you would want. Yeah.
The NFL Players Association was criticised for not taking enough action because in the United States, the NFL's history goes back to about the mid-90s, where it started investigating things, and there was criticism about the fact that they really could have done some more as the true representative body of the players. So it's an issue that has certainly come up, and we'll see where it goes.
Do you see any problem with the fact that, as you suggest, a players' union should have the players' best interests at heart? However, they also have the interest of keeping the player playing. So perhaps this is not the best regulation body to be able to say, this is how we need to deal with it. For me, in the riding sport, whenever I go to a horse show, there's no team doctor. We hire EMS to come in for the day. It is completely 100% independent from any team or anybody else's interest, other than the fact that you've been injured and you need medical attention, and they will ship you off to the hospital or do what they can for you at the moment on the scene. Now, there's no regulation as far as you having to fill out a form to get back on a horse and compete again. However, that medical advice that you receive is completely independent from any contract that you may have or any person that you're competing for, and that medical advice is centered around you and your healing and your well-being. So I guess my question to you would be, do you see a way to incorporate a truly independent medical team that can be there to make their analysis and to say, this is what needs to happen, as well as finding the national and international committees and bodies implementing this is what you need to do to be able to get back into competition, and have those things work together but not be of the same body?
So, of course, the team doctor or the doctor is certainly an actor in the regulatory space, in that he or she has the capacity to alter and influence the behaviour of the player. No, you're not going back on. So perhaps, Ryan, would you like to talk about that in the sense of the the role of the
It's
doctor.
interesting that the highest incidence of concussion occurs in the various disciplines of equestrian sport, winter sport, boxing, mixed martial arts, and so the classic AFL, Union League feature about 5th or 6th on the list at about 2 to 3 players per team per season, i.e. an incidence of about 4 to 5 per 1,000 player hours, and whereas these other sports are 10 and up, equestrian is almost 80. They're the sports that are the least well funded, the least resourced, and to put in place what isn't ideal and should be there is a massive undertaking. The AFL, Australian Rugby Union, and the NRL struggle to get it right, and it's not so much. And at least you can put those emergency medical structures in place at the event. The biggest problem is that the continuity of care and the correct protocol, which Lisa said, in returning those athletes or players safely to sport is just not there for them. And the nets, the sieve is just absolutely leaking all over the shop. And so, the hospital said, no, listen, you don't have structural brain injury, all good, go back to sport. But that's not the case. They haven't dealt with the functional brain injury. So, if I look at the amount of time in just putting Head Smart together, I mean, the cost is astronomical. I think we're almost at $1 million of investment in 4 years to get to where we're at, and it's not even touching the tip of the iceberg. So, wow, it's expensive, and you can try, I guess. So
that's right. But I think on that as well, if an equestrian athlete did fall off, had independent assistance, they may have been told, okay, don't get back on for a little while, but the following day is Olympic selection trial, that advice is out the window, and probably for any athlete trying to nudge into that, making that elite squad, making that Olympic team, making world championships, I think their own judgment of their health and well-being is gone because their goal is in their grasp, and I think that's their priority as opposed to their health. So how do we manage that?
Well, that's right. And they shouldn't be making the decision.
Exactly.
So that should be a medical decision that doesn't really involve their final say. Although, technically, Keith would probably say, well, and maybe there's an argument that medical personnel can give a recommendation, but ultimately the individual, if compos mentis, can make the final decision and take whatever risks. But that's the dilemma.
It's a complex issue, isn't it, Trevor?
Not sure if this is a question of emergency conservation kind of towards Dr. Fuller. But like talking about concussions, always in like ice hockey and American football, it's always talked about like repeated like subconcussive microtraumas that happen, rather than when a player gets like a full-blown concussion, and how important that is, and the health effects that can occur from like many repeated microtraumas as life goes on. So like a lot of football players may not get like full-blown concussions, but the regular head contact that they get may contribute to the negative health effects they experience later on in life.
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's been attempted to be studied, and using impact sensors, trying to look at what threshold of impact in terms of linear and acceleration forces are concussive. What's been published to date is that where there have been no clinical signs of concussion, those athletes have performed no differently neurocognitively, and they've looked at teams, ice hockey, whatever. They've had no medical consultation for an injury and repeated those measures at the end of the season. And with the measures that they could use, there was no difference. So it's sort of, I guess the subconcussive thing's gone a bit quiet in the last year when that data came up. But the measures are probably not good enough at the end of the day. I think you'd have to be almost baseline functional MRIing everyone and repeating that periodically and try and get some data there. I don't even think we've sorted out the concussive one yet to even take on the subconcussive, but it's got to be having some kind of effect. I just think you've got to have we know certainly in adolescent athletes where you've just got to be so much more conservative in any head injury incident just because of the really vulnerable developmental stage the brain is at, and the hits that they do take. That's probably as best we can get it. And also just risk profiling players as well, in terms of past history of concussions, associated psychological, psychiatric diseases, and you can at least pick up a trend of who your high-risk cases are.
So maybe we might be sitting here in 20 years' time and looking back and saying, okay, so did we take on concussion as a serious issue, and were the steps and measures that we took adequate to make sure that we continued to engage parents to ensure, carers to ensure that their sons, daughters or wards need to be engaged in sport, because the last thing we want is to ensure that, exclude those. In the US, they had a 9.2% reduction of kids going into peewee leagues, which I think is the Little League, because of the mums and dads and carers who were concerned about the risks. And the bubble sport, who had the bubble soccer slide we had on one of our presentations, is certainly not the ideal place we want to go to. Doing us